yeah, it seems like it's really picking up. Yeah, it's good to see. All right, so let me start sharing my screen. So lots of activities, as you noticed on Elsa 3. My list is very small, but you know, size isn't everything. If you look at the documentation updates, it's just a single line, but it's a lot of work, and it's something I want to show at least the current progress. Do you have any topics you would like to add to this list before we start?
Not really. That's all.
All right, good. Then yeah, let's dive right in. So one thing I did was cleaning up the menu. So there are still some 404s like the JavaScript and Liquids and user tasks, but everything else, at least there's some content. So it's not in its final shape. It's an ongoing process, of course. But we have had installation. We have had it for a while now, as we did for HTTP workflows. But now we also have external app integration, which explains one approach of integrating external applications with Elsa workflows. And actually, I'm going to demo an example of this. And it's basically where you would use Elsa workflows as an orchestrator, where you orchestrate the steps in a given process, but the actual execution happens in your own application. And this talks about how you how you can communicate with this using the webhooks module, which is an optional add-on. And that's just one implementation. There's different options you can take. It's very extensible, so it's possible to, for example, use your own message bus if you wanted to. This doesn't involve any message or service buses, but you could, and there will probably be a module for that as well at some point. So this is a nice list to go through if you want to try it out. There's also a new section about loading workflows from JSON. So some users prefer to have their workflow definition stored as part of their source code repository or maybe stored elsewhere. And then instead of loading it from the database, you want to load it from files. And this explains how you can go about it. So it starts off with a console application to really simple stuff, really. You just create a service provider, then you populate the registries, which is the activity registry and the expression provider registry. Normally this would happen during using a hosted service, but when you run a console app, there's no hosted services, so you will have to invoke this manually in order to get the most functionality going. At least, of course, you don't really need this either if you want to execute certain simple workflows, then it's okay, but usually you want those registries to be there. And then here it's using a standard API to read contents from some file, which represents a workflow. Then you need an activity serializer to deserialize this JSON into an actual workflow object. And once you have your hands on this workflow object, you can just run it using the workflow runner, and that's it. And in this example, we're using a very simple hello world workflow that starts with a flowchart. So this is a workflow that was designed using the designer. You don't need a flowchart, but when you use the designer, it will always use a flowchart. And then it just has one activity, which is a write line activity, and it writes this string to the console, and that's it. So that's a one way, but more practically, probably you will have an ASP.NET Core workflow server that you want to read from JSON files, maybe from some directory, or maybe from blob storage, or whatever the case may be. So this makes mention of a new workflow definition provider called Fluent Storage definition provider. And the reason it's called Fluent Storage Workflow Definition Provider is because it leverages the Fluent Storage library, which is the new version of its predecessor. What was it called? I think storage.net, I think was the previous, or was the name of the previous library that I used in Elsa too. But that project has been archived. So this is a new project that either is a fork of it, I'm not entirely sure, but it has the same functionality and I think even more. It also has support for messaging and some other things. So in any case, so that's the reason for the name of Fluent Storage. Okay, so we're back here, and this module uses this library to list all of the workflow files in a folder called workflows. So that's a default convention, but of course this is configurable. So here it's just walking you through the default configuration, where all you need to do is just call use Fluent storage provider on the Elsa module, and that's it. And then it uses default configurations. And as I mentioned, it will look for files in the workflows folder. So here I'm creating the same workflow file that we used in the console application. Then you just start the application, and because it's a workflow definition provider, all of the workflows in this folder will be available as workflows. So you can run them the same way you run any workflow you create using the designer. So here the definition it is hello world. So if you are using the REST API, you use that hello world definition in the URL here. So that's another article. User tasks remains to be done, and could be done on the POC that Christina wrote as a example reference application. That might be nice. Yeah, and then contribution from from a customer where they explain how you can invoke workflows. There's multiple ways, so you can use just an HTTP endpoint that is a trigger. So through HTTP endpoint, that's a very easy way to kick off workflows, of course. And then of course there's the API, which we just looked at as well here. So it's a nice summary of doing that. And it also mentions the dispatch API. So this one is executing it, well, quote, synchronously. Of course, it still uses async await, but it waits for the entire request to complete before it returns. And dispatch, on the other hand, just sends a message to some service bus, and then the service worker will somewhere in the background actually execute the workflow. So the HTTP request itself will return pretty much instantaneously. So it's a way to asynchronously start workflows without having to wait for the first burst of execution of the workflow to complete. So very nice contribution there. Worked on the core concepts. So programmatic versus designer workflows. So it starts explaining what's the difference. And of course, as you know, you can create workflows using C# classes, or you can use the designer. So it's more of an introduction also of what does it look like to do it through code, and what does it look like when you do it through the designer. And it also explains what is common. So it's what some of the feedback I got from Elsa too is, so it's oftentimes hard to understand. Let's say you have something in the designer, but now you want to implement it in code. How do you translate the two? So this is an initial attempt, at least, to try and explain the common aspects, but also what the differences are. And as it turns out, there's a big overlap, because whether you create it in code or in the designer, at the end of the day, what you're creating is an object graph representing your workflow. So the designer creates a JSON format that can be mapped onto an actual workflow graph. And the other way around, if you construct an object graph, if you were to serialize it, that would be the same JSON. Yeah, so this is a good one to go through if you're new to Elsa 3 to get an initial understanding. And then we continue with the workflow. And there's some repetition. So here again, it explains what is a workflow. So, but it looks at it from slightly different angles. So I'm hoping that it will make it easier to get the hang of various aspects of Elsa. So it talks about workflow execution. What is a definition? What is an instance? What is an execution context? So and again, it's of course an initial iteration. We'll expand on this as we get feedback. Same goes for activity. What is an activity? How do you create one? It talks about input and output and outcomes. It talks about activity metadata. So that's like namespace, category, description. It talks about composite activities, and it even shows a little example based on the if activity. And here it shows the if activity in action. It mentions blocking activities and, of course, triggers. And this is a light introduction to these concepts. Of course, there will be more detailed tutorials or guides on creating custom activities, for example. And through guides, we'll also show how input-output works in practice. Here it just explains the concept and a very simple example created in code. So here we have a custom activity called sum, which takes two inputs, and it sums those inputs together and returns an outcome. And what do we have here? We have output, and we also show how to use it in the designer. So this custom composite activity called sum is used here in the designer. Actually, no, I need to take that back. This is a tutorial about how to create the same composite activity in the designer, not using it from code, but creating it in the designer, and then how to use it in the designer right here. Actually, no, this is still just the implementation. It doesn't take the next step and then actually showing how to use it in the designer. So that might be good to add actually. Yeah, and then finally it mentions how to invoke workflows programmatically, so using the workflow runtime. And that's another thing I would like to add is just an overview of the various most important API services that you can use, because we have workflow runner, we have workflow runtime, we have registries. So it would be good to get an understanding of what fits where and when to use what. The concept of trigger and the concept of a bookmark, but this is it's a little bit meager in terms of explanation. So it should be expanded a little bit with some examples probably. Same goes for this activity library. It's a good start, but of course we'll want a little bit more detail, maybe some context of when to use a given activity, maybe an example use case, etc. Definitely work in progress. And as I mentioned, JavaScript Liquid needs to be added soon as well, because otherwise it becomes hard to understand what functions you can use. Even though there's IntelliSense, it would be good to have an overview all the same. So yeah, lots of work has been done already, but lots of work has yet to be done for the RC on for the end of the next month, May 31.
It's really nice and very well documented. I'm just wondering, for the persistence, is there any documentation currently for how to persist the workflows? What are the options for persistence?
No, but thank you for reminding me. Let's add it to the list. Let's see, maybe it's already there. So this is my little checklist to collect topics so that I don't forget, and to check off what has been done. Let's see if there's persistence. I don't think so. So let me add it. Not unimportant to have something about persistence.
Yeah.
All right. So I mentioned the external application integration, which relies on the RunTask activity. So I figured maybe this is a nice topic to demonstrate how it could work in practice. So let me stop this one. The designer is running. Yeah, okay. So for this demo, I have two applications, which is just a normal, just a workflow server. So that's the reference application here in the bundle. We have Elsa Workflow Server Web. So I'm gonna start this one, and the designer I start separately. This is more out of habit. I could have also started all-in-one web, which starts the server and the dashboard. But this is my habit, because as soon as I find an issue, I can immediately try and fix it and test it out. And that's a little bit harder to do with the all-in-one web, because it relies on the build output of the stencil project and the NuGet package. Well, not the NuGet package, but the project, which then references the npm package. So that started, and the other application is the external application, which I created in ASP.NET Core because that's my favorite framework, but it could have been PHP or Ruby on Rails, just as long as the framework supports HTTP communication, and you can use whatever. And that application is this one. So I have a sample application called onboarding. So this onboarding.web application represents, it's a very simple web app that has a database that stores tasks. And the idea is that, let's say you have a company and you want to, and you have a process to onboard new employees. And when you onboard a new employee, typically you need to do a few things like setting up an email account, creating a Slack account, adding them to the HR system and payrolling, etc. So those steps you orchestrate in Elsa, but the actual activities of performing those tasks like setting up an email account, that's handled in this application here. And it's not done automatically, although some of these tasks could be automated, maybe. Others are relying on people doing the actual work. And the point is, it doesn't matter from the workflow's perspective. All it does, it just it just sends a request to run some task, and this task has a name and some payload, and it's sent over to this external application, and it's up to the external application to deal with it. So let's start this application as well. All right, so we have this application, and it's based on I think the MVC app, the MVC with controllers. So I updated the homepage to just list a table of tasks, and the task consists of an ID, a name, a description, and the employee being onboarded. So that's this thing, but it's empty. So let's start let's go to the workflow design, and then here I have the workflow. So let's walk through it just briefly. The first thing it starts with is setting a variable, and so this workflow expects, it's not defined here, but it expects the employee to be input. And an employee is a very simple DTO consisting of just the desired email address to be created and the name of the employee. So imagine you have some application that kicks off this workflow, or maybe right now we'll do it using Postman. Doesn't really matter what the source is, but you need to somehow trigger the workflow. You provide the input in the form of an employee consisting of an email address and a name, and then we assign this information to the employee variable, which we declared here, and it's of type, well, it's listed as object, but I noticed there's a little bug. This should be JSON, although object will still work, but JSON is more appropriate because we are receiving some JSON input, which under the covers is in .NET, it's just an expando object, but so JSON it's like an alias. So like that. Once that variable is set, we kick off the tasks that will not execute in Elsa itself, but as I mentioned, will be dispatched to the external application. And for that, we are using the RunTask activity. And it's a very general purpose activity which allows you to specify the task name, which could be treated as an identifier in your external app to determine what you want to do. So you have to imagine this activity will indirectly invoke some webhook that is an endpoint in your external application, and it receives some payload, and the payload receives the task name, whatever payload you provide, and some additional information about the workflow instance itself, and in the future maybe some additional metadata. This description is wrong. Any async additional param, so it should just be any. I suspect this might have been Copilot. That's not something I would write. Or maybe I did, I don't know. In any case, so that's the first task. So we just provide a task name. And what we do return as a payload is the employee. So this is the JSON object we bound to this variable. So that will be an object containing the name and the email address and some description. And as you can imagine, you can add anything else that makes sense for your use case scenario. But for this demo, this suffices. So we'll leave it as this. And then notice that here, after this is done, oh, I forgot to mention the run task activity. It's a blocking activity. So what it will do, it will send this task to your external application. and then wait until the external application reports back that the task has been completed. So until then, the workflow will be sitting here. So the workflow will be suspended, go out of memory, doesn't matter. It's just waiting for the external application to report completion of the task. When that happens, execution splits into 4 branches, which means all 4 activities will run at the same time. Well, they will be executed sequentially one by one, but that happens very fast. So it's not like it has to wait before this one completes before this one executes. This will create a bookmark, this will create a bookmark, and this one after, or it creates the bookmark and then dispatches the task to the external application. So these things will create 4 tasks at the same time in the external application. So the effect will be that initially we'll just see 1 task for a user to complete. And as soon as they complete the task, they will see new tasks coming in, 4 of them to be precise. And once all 4 have been completed, once they are all completed, it will merge into the send welcome email. So yeah, and this will of course execute just once at the end. So let's see how it works. For that, I do need to start SMTP for dev, which is the SMTP servers for local development. Okay, and then we need to, we'll kick off this workflow in its draft. So let's make sure it's published. Go to Postman and copy the definition ID like that. And notice that I already have the input prepared here. So I'm going to send, as the input, I'm going to send an object called employee with a name and an email address. So I will send this now. We get as a response the workflow state, which is a recent change where instead of just returning the instance ID, it returns the entire state. Maybe we'll make it configurable. If we find that it might be too big of a response to send back, I don't know, but this could be an option of getting back as a response the entire object, right? So the workflow executed, we should be able to see the workflow instance here. And as we can see here, the set variable was executed and create email account. That's although it says completed, that's not accurate. It should be waiting or some other name because it definitely didn't complete. It's actually blocked on this one. And we can see here the payload that was sent as part of this activity. It's it's this JSON. All right, so let's take a look at the external app. I'll refresh the page. And it looks like something didn't go right. So let's see if we can figure it out. First thing to look at is the application console. Oh, I think I see. I think I started the wrong workflow server because I don't see any webhooks identified here. So what the RunTask does internally, it just fires a domain notification or a domain event that is then handled by the webhook module, which we have here, the webhooks module. What it will do internally, it will invoke a webhook, and that looks like this. So the webhook looks for webhook registration. 1 second, this is a level too deep. So the run task request is a notification that is published by the run task activity, handled by this handler, and what it will do, it will use the webhook dispatcher to fire this webhook event. So this webhook event's name is RunTask, so it's very much specific to the RunTask activity. And then this dispatcher looks for all registered webhooks, but we don't have any configured in this application, but we should have it in the onboarding workflow server. So here we have a section called webhooks with some exposed endpoints by the external application. So here we registered this webhook. So let's switch to this application. All right, let's refresh. Okay. Well, 1 second. So here I didn't create a workflow in the designer because I didn't add support for cross-origin resource sharing course. That's why we are seeing these errors. So here I created everything in code, which is functionally the same. What I could do is just copy and paste these settings to the workflow server. Actually, let's do that because maybe Mohammed doesn't believe me, so I'm gonna show that it will work. And then making sure that webhooks is installed. I don't think so. Let me see. So we'll do it like this. And then we'll say use webhooks. And then we'll configure it like this. So here we're reading it from app settings or from the configuration which contains the app settings, like this. Okay, so now we have the webhooks module installed and enabled. Let's run the workflow again. And let's see if we see something now. I was thinking to myself, I should try it before the meeting, but I was too confident that it would work. But I broke something somewhere. Let's see if we can find it. All right, let's do a little debugging session. I'm gonna set a breakpoint in the dispatcher, not this one, but I think I'm gonna set one here. All right, well, it will help if I attach the debugger first. I was running in without debugger. Okay, so here we are in the RunTask activity. We're going to dispatch this notification, and that didn't end up here, it seems. Let's try again. So we are using the asynchronous dispatcher, and that's going to publish this event here. So webhooks. Okay, so here we are in the RunTask handler in the webhooks module. So we're getting closer. And here we have the background webhook dispatcher. So let's see here, we got 0 registration. So I made an error with the configuration probably. So we have one webhook registration provider, which is the options webhook registration provider. And that one is returning nothing. Yeah, okay, options endpoint. So something is not right here. So let's go back to program. Use webhooks, configuration get section, bind to webhooks endpoints. All right, let's restart this application. Oh, that's dumb. I see. So webhooks is not options, it's a webhooks feature. So I didn't look at the type. So let me stop this. So what we want to do instead is say webhooks options. So here we get a callback to set the webhook options. So here we get options, which we then bind. Okay, so this time we do get the endpoints. So let's continue. So here we get a registration. Then here we're going to invoke it. And then here we get into the HTTP webhook invoker. So this is still in the workflow server, and it's now about to make an API call to the external application on the registered URL, which is the 5002 port API webhooks RunTask. And to be clear, it's up to the external application to determine what the endpoint should look like. So here it's configured like this. So we're invoking it now. We get a successful response, so that's good. Which also should mean that now the this external application should have created a task. So let's make sure that's the case. All right, so here it is, and just for your information, just taking a quick look at the API endpoint internal implementation. Here we have the webhook controller. So this is the endpoint exposed. So we just invoke this action, which receives a webhook event model, which is declared here locally to this project. And it consists of the event type that we discussed, the payload, and a timestamp when the webhook was fired. And then what we do here, we just create a new onboarding task instance and store it in the database. And that's it. So very, very simple here. And then of course, in the home controller, in the index action, we list all of the available tasks. So that's what we see here. So we have one task for this employee to be onboarded. And the task is to create an email account for the new employee. So imagine you are somebody from IT of this company, and now you set it up and then you click on the complete button. And because we have still the debugger attached, we continued the workflow, and the workflow is now firing off the additional tasks. So that's why we are in this debugger again. So let's ignore this. The screen, although it refreshed, because the the workflow server executes asynchronously. Depending on how fast it executed, we would have seen the task appear here or not. But usually you wouldn't see it unless you do a regular refresh, or if you implement some signal R communication. That's beyond this, outside the scope of this demo. But if you refresh the page, you will see the newly created tasks. So these are the tasks we see here. So creating a Slack account, GitHub, etc. So to be sure, we haven't received an email yet, of course. We first need to complete the remaining tasks. So we'll create a Slack account, done. We'll add them to the HR system. And by the way, the reason this demo shows creating multiple tasks is because the first task, this one, is a dependency for all of these. So just to show that you can choose to have sequential tasks or even tasks running in parallel, maybe even assigned to different members of your staff. So that's the reason why this is running in parallel, because individually they are not dependent on one another. They just depend on the employee having an actual account set up. All right, so then the final one. And now we should have received an email. Oh, look, we have a out refresh error. So let me refresh here. And indeed, we received an email sent to the new employee. So the new employee is being welcomed on board. All right. And of course, it also works when you have multiple employees. So if you look at the onboarding web example, I mean the workflow server example, there's a sample HTTP file that can send multiple requests. So I could send one for these employees at once. So let's see how that works. So I fired 3 of those requests. So we have 3 more workflow instances running at this point, which also means we should see at least 3, just 3 tasks in the dashboard if it worked. So something went wrong, it seems. Oh, of course, because these calls are tailored to this workflow server, which has, as I mentioned, the workflow implemented in code, which has a different definition ID. So here I'm using onboarding workflow as a definition ID. So of course this doesn't exist in the workflow that we created in the designer, but that's okay. Now that we're looking at this file, let's take a look at the workflow, how you would implement it in code. So in code, you have to implement the I workflow interface or derive your class from workflow base, which brings a few convenience methods for you. So this is the recommendation to implement this base class. Then you get a workflow builder. This is a new activity called parallel. So it's the opposite of sequence. Parallel also allows you to set a list of activities to run, but instead of them running sequentially, they run at the same time. So we have them running in parallel, which is suitable for this example, right? In the designer, however, there's no designer support for parallel or sequence activities, but using the flowchart activity, you can achieve the same effect because of the forking and joining capabilities of a flowchart. So, but when using code, a parallel is more convenient to use than having to use the flowchart, because then you first need to define the activities, and then separately you need to then connect them using connection objects, which is less convenient in code. All right, so that's the code stuff here.
I have one question. How does the run task activity get the feedback from the external system? So
Good
it
question.
sends a webhook request, and then is it waiting for a response, or?
That's right. So the run task activity creates a bookmark and then suspends. It creates a bookmark and that's it. It doesn't complete itself. It also doesn't block the workflow instance from going out of memory. So it will just the workflow runner will just see, for example, if it encounters this activity, which creates a bookmark, it doesn't complete, which means no subsequent activities will be scheduled, which means the workflow will now become suspended. There's no more work to be done, so it's just going to go to sleep until the bookmark gets resumed. So how does this bookmark get resumed? I'm glad you asked. That happens like this. So let me show you the external application. So the external application, we have the home controller, and remember we have buttons, right? So let me run the workflow just real quick. So here we have the complete button. When we click this one in the external application, we invoke this action. And then what it does, it will find the task ID that was being clicked. And then it uses an HTTP client. Here it's called Elsa client, but it's just a thin wrapper around an HTTP client that does the following. So it invokes an endpoint on the workflow server called tasks, task ID, and then complete. And this endpoint on the workflow server will then resume the bookmark associated with this task. And it will also include any result. So in this demo, we're not providing any input, but we could provide some additional data if we wanted to, which can then be used in the workflow. So let's take a look at this endpoint from the workflow server. For that, we go to Elsa Workflows API. Here we have a tasks resource and then the complete endpoint. So this endpoint will be invoked on the server, and it internally just defers to the task reporter. So that's an API to report completion of a given task. So it's associated by this task ID. And here you can see it's going to construct a bookmark to be resumed. So it's associated by this task ID. That's how it's able to locate the bookmark, which is part of the hash of the bookmark. And we provide some input if we, it can be null, but it could also have some application specific data. Then we generate the activity type name, which we need in order to resume a bookmark. We need to provide it with a bookmark payload and the activity type name associated with the bookmark, the input, and then we just dispatch this request. And this will then cause the blocked activity to be resumed, which will then, if we look at the run task activity, so here, just to go over the execute method, what it will do, it will create this bookmark as mentioned. And then when this bookmark gets resumed, we end up in this method here. So when we're creating a bookmark, we specify this callback, and this callback will then be invoked by the runtime. All it does, it just sets any input that it received, it will pass it along as its output. In our case, we don't have any input, so there will be no output, but then it will complete itself. So through the complete activity async, that's how you explicitly complete your activity, and that will cause the flowchart activity to schedule these next activities. And the same works for these, of course, because these are the same activities, the same run task.
Okay, so does it mean that the external application has to be aware about Elsa? It needs to use the client API?
No, not necessarily. In this case, it needs to be aware of the run task / complete or the complete task endpoint. So it does have to understand how to report task completion, in this case through an HTTP endpoint call, but it's not limited to that. You could also have chosen to send a service bus message to some queue and then have the workflow server listen on that queue, and then the consumer would then resume the workflow. So it's very extensible, but out of the box we'll have a couple of convenient modules to allow you to just use it without having to implement it yourself. So HTTP webhook communication is just very common. Of course, service bus messaging is very common, so we'll provide an example for that as well, or even a module that you can use. Yeah, and maybe there's different mechanisms that you want to use, and you can do it by following this example of using the task reporter, which is a convenience service that you can use.
Because I would imagine the external systems like an IT help desk system might also implement in a similar way. They have their own webhooks and they can be configured to trigger the workflow. So it will be in both directions.
Yeah, absolutely.
And is it possible to report an error status? For example, you are trying to create an account for an email that already exists, so you cannot proceed with the workflow.
Yeah, I was anticipating that question, and the answer is right now there's no support yet, but I think it makes sense to be able to configure the run task maybe with additional outcomes. So either it should be a fixed predefined set, let's say completed and canceled and maybe failed, for example, so that the external application can provide the the actual result, whether it succeeded, canceled, or failed, or maybe it should be configurable. And then it becomes very application specific. So maybe for a create email account, there could be 2 results. One would be okay, and another one could be already exists, as you mentioned. And then for creating the Slack account, there could be different results, different outcomes. What you can do already today, of course, is just provide the actual result through the output that you can send from the external application. So from the external application, you can pass along some arbitrary application specific data, which could include details about whether the task succeeded or not. And then in your workflow, you can handle this data by using the flow switch activity or the flow decision activity to set up a condition based on the input you received. But to keep your workflow concise, it would be nicer to be able to map it to actual outcomes, so that you don't have to do these flow decision or flow flow switch activities.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah, that would be a good enhancement to have. But yeah, and as you can see, this way you can have simple orchestration, but have the actual complexity of your task details implemented elsewhere in your own application, or even in the Elsa workflow itself. Of course, you can always create custom activities. That's a very easy way. But maybe there's a reason where you just want to use these activities and then handle the domain event in your workflow server application manually. So here we have just, of course, the example of the webhooks module, but it's not limited to using the webhooks module. You can just have your own handler called RunTask handler, and you just inspect the task being requested. So it contains the task ID and the task name, and your application could just handle this and do some work, maybe start a job or do whatever. And indeed, you could use it to send a service bus message yourself using a custom message broker or maybe a different mechanism that you have. So it's a good extensibility point like this.
And do you have any certain target systems that you want to demonstrate? For example, ServiceNow or similar systems that you want to demonstrate this integration? Because I think this will be also a good way to promote this functionality, that many companies, they're already using some help desk system or service system, and they might have many workloads where they want to do more integration, which is not coming out of the box.
That's a good point. I haven't thought about that, but that's a great suggestion.
Because
If you have
definitely,
some
yeah,
concrete ideas and suggestions on what would be a good showcase, then we should create an issue for it and set up a guide or a demo application.
Yeah, I'm not sure how it can be done, but because there might be a commercial application. But if we can, for example, demonstrate certain system, maybe ServiceNow, Freshservice, or any kind of these help desk systems, then we can promote this feature as a really strong feature that we can utilize.
I sure like the sound of that. Yeah, let's think on that and see what we can do.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard of ServiceNow.
Yeah, I'm not sure it is the same site. Maybe it's, I need to check. It looks different. So I'm not sure this is the same one or not. But
Sure.
we commonly use it, for example, for help desk support. And I just send an email that I'm having a problem with my PC. They will register it as a ticket, and then the ticket will start a certain process internally. And sometimes they need to integrate with our system, for example, with procurement. You need to buy a new hardware, and so on.
That's really good. That's a great example to use the Elsa workflow for, and showing this deeper integration from using webhooks from both sides.
Exactly.
Yeah, if you don't mind, then you can think of a sample like this and a good use case. Then I would love to create a reference application and really showing the actual implementation using a real service account so that you can actually try it. Or of course, people will have to create their own test accounts, but then they can actually give it a test drive.
Sure.
Nice. Yeah, that's good. So as you can see, just 2 little items, but we're already over time. Of course, we had a little bit of a debugging session. Might have been instructive as well. Do you have any questions at this point, Mohammed?
It's really interesting, and I think it's coming to a very good shape. So really excited for this. And personally, I hope I can start using Elsa 3 soon. I have it in my mind also because so far I'm still stuck with Elsa 2 because this is what we have. This is what we're working on in production. But it's really, really exciting. I really want to get on board of this, and I have many ideas that I want to.
Great. Yeah, I look forward to hearing those ideas and also getting your feedback on when you actually get your hands dirty on it. I share the excitement. I think it's coming together quite nicely, as you say. But I also realized there's a lot of things yet to be done. Lots of smaller details. Well, some are small, some are more serious. But I think we're getting ready for a decent RC at the end of May, because already it's becoming quite useful.
Yeah, that's very nice.
All right, then thank you for joining, and I'll catch you next week.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you. You too.